Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is day 2 of our user group. I hope everyone enjoyed day 1. And we wanted to kick off day 2 with the keynote called Interoperability Evolved. And so we're going to talk about a lot of great stuff over the next 90 minutes. I want to start by giving a few statistics about the user group and setting the stage. And then I want to give an update on the trends that we talked about in last year's keynote. Because if you were with us last year, you remember that we had a discussion about the future of interoperability. We identified a few trends. I want to give an update on the progress of those, including what Lineate has done to help progress those trends. I also want to add some new trends to the list of things to watch, and then we'll wrap up with a summary and next steps. So that's what we have in store, and we'll jump right in. First of all, thanks for attending today. Thanks for attending the user group. I wanted to give a quick encapsulation of how far we've come. We have data on user group attendance going back 3 years before this one. And so I just wanted to run through that to show the growth, because it's very impressive, and we're really proud of the way that we've turned the user group into a major event for us. Prior to merging CorePoint and Rhapsody in 2018, we had separate user groups, of course, and the attendance was a little bit, about 100 for each separate organization. 210 people total attended those user groups. In 2019, we had our first combined event. It was an in-person event in Texas, and we had about 300 people attend. So we were up 50%, almost 50% in 2019. And that was a great event. It was, obviously our first one as a combined organization. We had only been combined for a few months by that point. And so there were some rough edges to that event, but it was fun to get all of the users from both products together in one place and be able to socialize. In 2020, obviously, we went virtual because of the pandemic, and far from being a drag on the user event, it actually increased attendance. And I think that's because when you take travel out of the equation, it makes it much easier for our customers to send, their whole department to the event instead of 1 or 2 representatives. Plus, there's organizations that just can't travel, or international customers who can't make it to Texas. All of those obstacles go away when you go virtual, and so that's what we've seen starting in 2020. 2021 again is a virtual event, and we've seen another increase. As of last week, we had 725 people registered. I'm not sure what the final attendance number is, but I think I heard it's over 850 already. So this bar is a little too short. But it looks like Andy put in the chat 900 plus. So that's quite a substantial increase, even since last week, of registrants. So we're excited about that. Going forward in the future, I think what we've learned is that the virtual events just have too many advantages. I actually, based on yesterday's sessions, I actually like the format quite a bit. It makes it very easy to interact with other attendees and the presenters. It's really easy to organize your work, and we have a great new platform this year. There were some drawbacks of last year's platform, but this year I think it's much more in tune with how we want the user group to be. So I'm hopeful that going forward we maintain the online version of the user group, even though we miss being in person. Maybe we can have a hybrid event in the future. So that's what we're looking forward to. But what we're finding is that the year-over-year growth is nothing short of astounding. If you look at 900 people in 2021 versus 200 in 2018, that's incredible growth in a short time. So thanks to everyone for attending and participating and making this event a success. I want to talk about the nature of today's keynote. Most keynote sessions that you attend are focused on the distant future. They put together a vision of what the future of interoperability will be like in 10 years or 20 years, or when all of our current problems are overcome. And they may have demos or scenarios or paint a picture of how good things are going to be when today's current obstacles are no longer an issue. It's very inspirational. It gets you really excited about the work that you're doing and the industry that you're in. But ultimately, when you get back to your desk, you sit down and you don't have a good idea of what concrete steps can I take right now to help realize that vision. And so then it's, at worst it's deflating. At best, it's something that you just file away as a fond memory. And so I don't want to be that kind of keynote. I want to be a much more tactical keynote. I want to focus on like a 2 to 5 year time horizon, because those ideas are maybe already on your radar. Or if they're not on your radar, you can put them on your radar. You have enough time to act on them, but those concepts are still near enough that you can do something about them. In other words, we're not telling you about something that's imminent, that's too late to take advantage of, and we're not telling you about something that's so far out you can't really participate in it. We're trying to hit that sweet spot of things that are in that zone where there's still a chance to participate in it if you're not already. So that's the frame that I want to put around this keynote. It's the future of interoperability, but it's not the far distant future. It's the near-term future that is within sight. So I wanted to set up our 2 to 5 year trends. Last year we looked at 3 different trends, and I don't think I explicitly said that they were in the 2 to 5 year time window, but they were. And now we're a year into that 2 to 5 year window. So let's give an update on how the trends have progressed. Like I said, let's also see how Lineate has participated in those trends. And it's also important to review last year's trends, because not everybody attended last year's keynote. They don't necessarily know what trends we talked about last year. So picking it up in midstream without reviewing is not going to make a lot of sense. So we'll take a quick look at the 3 trends we looked at last year, and we'll see where they're going next. Plus, we'll add a new trend. So the 3 trends that we talked about last year were the shift to cloud computing, the global pandemic, and FHIR adoption. And they're not necessarily all starting at the same time. Some of them were already well underway when we talked about them last year. Some of them were just getting started when we talked about them last year. And so the graphic on the right is intended to show like how near term they are. So the darker the bar is, the more attention is being paid to that trend at a given point in time. So if you look at the shift to cloud computing, it's got a very light bar at the beginning, up through last year's user group. But now the bar is starting to get darker, and that's because we're starting to see much more attention being paid to cloud computing in our industry. And the bar stays dark for an indeterminate amount of time into the future, which is to say that we'll be shifting to cloud computing for the next several years, at which time it will fade away again. That doesn't mean that we move out of the cloud. It just means that the shift is complete and we'll be mostly there. Same thing with global pandemic. That was well underway in last year's user group, and so that's why the bar is dark in October 2020. I've speculated that not in the not too distant future it will start to taper off. So that may be wishful thinking, but we'll see. These are not intended to be scientifically accurate. It's just intended to show an approximate relative heat map of the timelines at which each trend is popular. So let's start by talking about the global pandemic first. Let's get the bad news out of the way. The global pandemic is something that's impacted everybody. I'm sure you all read the news, so I don't think I need to go into too much depth about what's going on with the pandemic. But I will call out some data from our own experience. As you know, we have an office in New Zealand. And so I wanted to contrast what we're seeing with our colleagues in New Zealand versus what we're seeing with our colleagues in the United States. And anytime you compare New Zealand to the US, there's an immediate objection, which is, the United States is a much larger country. It's connected with land borders to other countries. New Zealand is an island with a much smaller population. So you can't really compare them in an apples to apples fashion. So what I did was I looked for another country that was an island with about 5 million people. And I found Ireland matches that profile. But Ireland has followed the US model more than the New Zealand model. And so what you can see is the red line, which is the US, and the blue line, which is Ireland, track pretty closely together because they followed a similar strategy, whereas New Zealand has a different line. It's the green line. It has a different pattern. So I should call out that the scale on the y-axis is logarithmic, which means that every time you go from one line to the next one, you're not going up by one increment, you're going up by a factor of 10. And you can see that New Zealand had about 1 case per million for most of the pandemic until recently they shot up to 10 cases per million. And the US and Ireland were on a much different trajectory. And the reason is because we took different approaches to reacting to the pandemic. The US and other countries like Ireland focused on developing a vaccine as quickly as possible. In the US, we had Operation Warp Speed. And what they accomplished was, nothing short of miraculous to get a vaccine developed, tested, and into the market in such a short time was extremely important in terms of reacting to the pandemic. It has also provided us with quite a lot of experience and research and best practices on quickly developing vaccines for the future. So that's been a huge advantage. New Zealand took a different approach. They concentrated on testing, tracing, isolation, and border restrictions. The pattern in New Zealand was to control the outbreak as much as possible for as long as possible. And you can see that for most of the pandemic, they did a great job. And it's only recently with the Delta variant that the number of cases has started to go up. But the good news is that they're beginning to get critical mass of vaccinations. The inset, the small graph in the lower right, shows the vaccination rates of the 3 countries. And so the colors match. I realize that when you have Ireland as one of the items you're graphing and green as one of the colors, you'd expect Ireland to be the green one, but in fact, New Zealand is the green one. I didn't have control over how our world in data decided to color the lines. But really, this isn't meant to say that one approach is good and one approach is wrong. What this is meant to say is there's no good way to react to a pandemic, right? It's such a staggering obstacle to confront that there is no good reaction. That's why I put pick your poison in parentheses in the first bullet point. They're both bad options, right? One option gives you more cases of infection. The other option is really not great for the economy, and neither one of them is good. Different countries can choose different approaches, and it's really just a matter of what works for that country and what is best for the population there. And I just wanted to point out that since we do have employees in both locations, we're actually have a front row seat to see the differences between them. And like I said, neither one of them is good, but the two of them are different, and it's interesting to see those differences. So what's the update for the global pandemic? Last year, we had quite a bit of speculation about what the impact would be, who the winners and losers would be as a result of the pandemic. And there was a hypothesis that anything that limits in-person contact would benefit from the pandemic, and anything that depends on in-person contact would decline. And that seems obvious. It was partly correct, but there was some surprises. And so I wanted to talk through a few of the mixed results. The first one is telehealth. As you remember, when the pandemic started, the hospitals canceled all the elective procedures. They wanted to see as few patients as possible. both to minimize the risk of spreading infection and also as a way to conserve space and resources for COVID cases that were coming into the hospital, which meant that every hospital had to hurry up and implement telehealth if they didn't have it already. And what we saw was the number of virtual encounters spiked from a pre-pandemic level to 78 times the pre-pandemic level, which is huge growth. I know that the pre-pandemic level wasn't immense. We were going 78 times a pretty small baseline, but that's still huge growth in a matter of weeks. Since that time, the number of virtual encounters has declined, but it's still at 38 times the pre-pandemic level, which is a really big adjustment, and it's because of huge investments and experience in telehealth over the past 18 or 20 months of the pandemic, and going forward into the next 18 months. There's a lot of funding going into telehealth, improving broadband for rural areas so that we can extend telehealth out to places that are not well covered by network connectivity. And there's discussions about making permanent the changes around licensure and billing so that it's easier to have cross-state virtual encounters and easier to bill at the appropriate rate that makes telehealth a profitable proposition for hospitals. So all of this is going on. Telehealth is definitely a winner from the pandemic, or maybe if not a winner, at least its win has been accelerated due to necessity. But I think of telehealth as version 1 of virtual encounters, because when version 1 of any virtual technology comes out, it's really a literal translation of what it's replacing. If you're old enough to remember when the World Wide Web started to take off among commercial enterprises, when the .com top-level domain came out, every company treated it like a marketing opportunity. And so they went to their marketing department and said, hey, take our marketing material and shovel it onto the World Wide Web. We want to be on the web. And so version 1 of the World Wide Web was really nothing but a bunch of marketing brochures in electronic format. And it was very much a paper experience that you were viewing through your screen. As the technology started to mature, and especially as people started to get experience with the unique ways of designing and interacting with the web, you started to see much more richer and better designed websites that took advantage of the technology's unique capabilities. So when you talk about Web 2.0, it unlocked a lot of capabilities that were not present in the original version. And that's what we're seeing with medicine as well. Version 1 of virtual encounters was take a regular in-person encounter and make it electronic. Use video technology and audio technology and network technology to conduct the same encounter you would have conducted in your office, only with the patient and the doctor in separate locations. And that's never going to go away. That's always going to be important. But what we're seeing is an evolution of that, and that goes by a different name, remote patient monitoring. This is a more native digital experience. What it means is that patients are monitored with devices, and these could be clinical grade devices, or they could be consumer grade devices. But the important thing is that the patient themselves is monitored 24/7 by this device, and the device communicates back to a care team that can see all the patients they're monitoring on a dashboard and zero in on the ones that need attention. And there's a lot of cool use cases around this, and we have a lot of customers that are implementing actually both telehealth and remote patient monitoring. And the reason I like remote patient monitoring is because it does exactly the same thing as Web 2.0 did. It set aside the idea of a literal translation of the old technology and replaced it with a more digital native version. And I think they will continue to exist side by side, but remote patient monitoring feels a little bit more advanced. And there's a lot of unexploited use cases there. So it's an exciting place that we can look at. A few of the surprises. like we said, anything that limits in-person contact should have been a winner as a result of the pandemic. And you would think prescriptions by mail would be in that category. But surprisingly, there was really no change. Refills are about the same as they were prior to the pandemic, and new prescription starts are actually down 25%. So prescriptions by mail seemed like an obvious way to limit in-person interaction. It turned out to hold steady instead of advancing at the same pace, certainly at the same pace that telehealth did. A couple of the other things, these are not directly related to limiting in-person contact, but public health was obviously put under tremendous stress during the pandemic. There was a substantial increase in electronic lab reporting. I think we talked about this last year. Electronic lab reporting has been around a long time, but our public health department customers have built interfaces and scaled their technology for whatever load they were seeing during peacetime, a few thousand electronic lab reports per week, maybe. Obviously, with COVID, you have a few thousand a day, or in some larger states, maybe a few thousand reports per hour. And to multiply the volume 30-fold or 50-fold puts a lot of strain on something that was designed for a much lower capacity. So we've seen quite a lot of struggle among our public health customers in responding to that, and they're doing a great job of meeting the challenge. But it's been tough for them. So, congratulations and thanks to them for their perseverance during the pandemic. We have a little bit more information about public health going forward on a later slide, so I'll stop talking about that there and move on to contact tracing, which is in a way a subset of public health. Contact tracing is something that public health departments have always done to limit the spread of infectious diseases. When there's a report of an infectious disease or perhaps a foodborne illness, the public health department gets in contact with the affected individuals and tries to find out where they were, who else they've been in contact with, and then follow up with everyone in that chain of contact. And by and large, we did a poor job of this in the U.S. 2 of 3 individuals with COVID were either not contacted or named 0 contacts, which kills your contact tracing really quick. We did a pretty good job of it initially. The very few first cases that entered the U.S. had some good contact tracing around them that helped delay the entry of COVID into the U.S. But at the time, we had very poor testing capabilities, and that made it really difficult to do the testing part of testing and tracing. And certainly some Asian countries have done a great job of contact tracing. We already talked about New Zealand's strategy. So this is something that's been very uneven. Contact tracing has worked in some places. In the US, it hasn't worked. And I think there's a natural reason for this. Contact tracing depends largely on humans picking up the phone and calling other humans. And when we started the pandemic, we had a very small number of contact tracers. For the same reason we had a limited capacity to handle electronic lab reporting. The system was designed for relatively few cases. And you can scale up that workforce, but it scales linearly. You can add 1 or 2 or 10, or even if you can add 50 contact tracers per week or per month, you're scaling that linearly, and the number of disease cases is scaling exponentially. So there's just no way to keep up with it. And at some point, we found that we couldn't really keep up with it effectively. And as a result, the contact tracing aspect of public health hasn't been a good weapon for us in the pandemic. Okay, so going forward, what's next for the pandemic response? Well, we know that in the past we've had underfunding of public health departments for years, and that has led to an infrastructure that's sort of frozen in time. It hasn't been upgraded. It hasn't matured. It's not necessarily taking advantage of the latest technologies. At least if it is, it's very uneven. It's not an overall uplift in capability. It's also led to a declining workforce. The graph on the right shows the relative workforce in public health over time. And this is really the worst place to be when a pandemic starts. And ironically enough, or sadly enough, shortly before the pandemic, the attention was getting some attention from Congress and from other stakeholders. Really, basically, the Congress people were saying that they can't make decisions about legislation without accurate information about public health statistics, and the root cause was due to underfunding of the infrastructure and the workforce. And so they had started to allocate money to fix the problem. But then the pandemic hit, and obviously quite a lot more funding flowed into public health. But we were already behind the curve. So it's unfortunate. I mean, if that infrastructure funding had come a couple of years earlier, we may have been in a better position. But in the end, there's nothing that could have really blunted the impact of a pandemic of this scale. We may have had a better response, or limited, delayed the introduction into the U.S. of coronavirus, or maybe flattened the curve a bit. But in the end, I think we still would have been in for a rough ride. The good thing about the pandemic funding is that while a lot of the money is tied to immediate needs, like getting vaccinations out to everybody and tracking the data, a lot of the funding is also tied to go forward preparedness, building the infrastructure that can handle pandemic outbreaks in the future. The focus there is on innovation, which addresses the antiquated infrastructure, sustainability, and equity. So that's really good to see that that we'll be not just addressing the immediate problem. We're not fixing the broken thing as much as we are putting a new system in place that addresses the underlying problems. I want to conclude my comments about the pandemic with a note that it's been going on long enough that some of the people who've been responding to it are starting to write books. And there's two out right now that came out at sort of the same time that are really good. One is by Andy Slavitt. It's called Preventable, and he's more on the left side of the political spectrum. The other one is by Scott Gottlieb on the right side of the political spectrum. It's called Uncontrolled Spread. And the thing I like about these, I think my recommendation is to read both of them because you're going to get two different views of the same timeline. And what you'll see is that both of them are starting from the same facts and putting their own different spin on it from the left and from the right. I'm not going to take a position on who's better or who's worse or which one's right. But the nice thing about it is that it's a civilized discussion. It's not the polarizing invective that we're used to on Twitter. Even if you don't agree with the position of one of the authors, it won't make you mad what they're saying. It may make you think, and that's really what you want from this type of discussion. And I think that seeing both points of view is super valuable. So that's my recommendation for your reading list relative to the pandemic. Moving on to more positive things, I'll talk about the shift to cloud computing. And I have a few specific predictions about what will happen as we move toward the cloud in healthcare. The first one is that VPNs will fade away. The reason why we have VPNs, why they're so prevalent in healthcare interoperability, I think, is a historical reason. The applications that are talking to one another were designed in an era when the expected deployment pattern was for all of them to be in the same data center, on the same network, and talking in a secure environment. And as we started to have the need to talk to applications that were on different networks, possibly in different organizations or at different sites, the architecture of the application hadn't changed. And so there was no way to secure the communications from application to application. We needed to secure the network itself. And the easiest way to do that was with a VPN. But we don't like VPNs because they tend to be the weak link in an interface chain. They go down easily. They're hard to diagnose sometimes. They're hard to repair sometimes. And it'll be good if they fade away as the cloud takes off. When all the applications are in the cloud, you're talking cloud to cloud, a VPN doesn't make sense. And so it'll be good to see those fade away. The other thing we expect to see is the concept of gateways taking off. When you have everything in the cloud that needs to talk to everything else in the cloud, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have every application talking to every other application directly. It definitely makes sense to have the concept of a gateway to enforce security, authorization, consent, and really to just act as that single front door for all the systems under your control. When third parties or even first parties, your own developers, are building applications against your data sources, you don't want them to have to know all the different ways to connect to all your different systems. You don't want them to have to figure out all the different data structures. You want that work to be done by a component that you control. And a gateway is a perfect place to do that. Plus, it has all those other advantages of being a single point at which you can enforce security and API call throttling. All those things can happen in a gateway. So that's a component of healthcare interoperability that may be absent in today's world, but we expect to see it as cloud deployments take off. Number 3, we expect all of our favorite standards to remain relevant and in existence. We're still going to do HL7. We're still going to transfer CCD documents. We're going to make FHIR API calls. There may be new patterns of using them that follow workflows that are more adapted to cross-organizational interoperability. But the foundational standards should remain the same, which is really good because it means all the investments you've made in tools and data analysis and even workforce education will remain relevant as we go forward. Cybersecurity obviously becomes hugely important in the cloud because now the data is living out there somewhere that's easier to access from anywhere in the world. You don't have that same perimeter control that you have in your own data center. And so cybersecurity will start to become a bigger component of everything we do. And we had some great sessions about cybersecurity yesterday, which, I mean, it kind of blew me away. We have the smartest customers out there talking about cybersecurity stuff that is really advanced. So that's impressive to see. And then finally, we'll see sort of the rise of consumer health data because consumers are already in the cloud. Quite a bit of what consumers do is on their mobile phone, which is usually plugged into a cloud service on the back end. They're uploading everything there, right? Their photos and their Facebook posts and their fitness data. As that data in the cloud is more adjacent to healthcare data in the cloud, we'll start to see those merging together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on an upcoming slide. Generally, in the future, we do expect EHR systems to remain the system of record. And those systems might be on-prem, or they may migrate to the cloud. But we still expect the EHR to be the center of the universe for healthcare. Systems of engagement, however, will start to creep outside of the boundaries of the EHR. This is our prediction. We're starting to see this happen. We think it's a trend that'll take off over time. Originally, the EHR vendors wanted to be both the record-keeping system and the place where clinicians did all of their work, including reports, analytics, patient outreach. There's a tethered patient portal associated with almost every EHR. And that's a great way to do things, but it does lead to a monolith, right? You have all of this functionality from one vendor, and over time, we expect parts of that functionality to be superseded by specialists. And so we may end up in a place where the preferred approach is a best-of-breed solution, where systems of engagement that clinicians are using to communicate with patients or that care managers are using to engage with patients may still rely on the EHR as a data-keeping system, but put the functionality in a separate application. And that's enabled by the prevalence of APIs that EHRs are starting to expose. I think it's the vision that ONC set out years ago. And it's starting to become possible, if not fully adopted, in today's world. So that's what we think about EHRs in the cloud. Another thing that we expect to see is the cloud infrastructure vendors, and by this I mean the big guys of Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, plus others. They're going to continue to innovate in this space, and they're going to compete to host everybody's data. They make money by hosting data and then providing value-added services on top of it. So we expect them to continue to innovate. We haven't really seen any of the tech giants build that killer app for healthcare. And I think that's by design. I think they don't want to be competing with healthcare IT specialists in application space. They prefer to provide the infrastructure, which they're already good at. They know how to do it. They know how to make it secure and available and easily accessible. And I think that's where they want to make their entree into healthcare. So we'll start to see them building out better facilities for storing that healthcare data, and then sharing it among relevant stakeholders, and then building those value-added services on top of it, which can then be incorporated into innovative technologies. So that should be exciting to see. And then just the final bullet point there says that, you know what, some healthcare use cases really are better suited to the cloud because they involve large amounts of data. They require elastic resources because sometimes you have high demand and sometimes you have lower demand. So the cloud really is a good place for big data sets. We've seen this in other industries, and healthcare is no exception. Okay. So just to give you an idea of some of the things Lineate has been doing relative to cloud solutions. We had a session yesterday about our cloud solutions, so I won't belabor this, but I'll mention that we have Rhapsody as a service, which is hosted infrastructure with the client in control of the engine. We have Envoy, which is a fully managed cloud solution. We have a lot of customers that are deploying Rhapsody and CorePoint into their own cloud. We call that bring your own cloud. To us, it looks like an on-prem deployment because we've provided the software to our customers and they've deployed it somewhere. It just happens to be in the cloud instead of on-prem. We're starting to support, we're starting to see more demand for hybrid on-prem and cloud solutions. So those are some of the things we're doing with our current engines. We're also looking at microservices hosted by AWS, and we've debuted our first one. It's a microservice that wraps an IHE transaction in EBXML. And instead of building an interface in your interface engine to do this, you can make an API call to this cloud-based microservice on Amazon and have it do all the work for you and send the result back. So it makes it very easy to sort of slice off that piece of the interoperability problem and hand it off to a microservice. This microservice is not going to change the world, but it's a good start, right? It's our first adventure into microservices, and so we're using it as a a pilot or a beta test. So we learned quite a lot from doing that. I do want to mention a couple of things. First of all, Rhapsody as a service is something that we built in direct response to a customer request. We had a customer approach us. Actually, I think he's the next one on the agenda after me today, who said, look, we want to stand up your engine in the cloud. If you do that, we'll obviously go forward with an implementation of it. And we took a look at the problem and said, yeah, we think we could do that. And so we built Rhapsody as a service in direct response to what a customer wanted to do. The other one is the microservices. That also came from the suggestion of a customer. And they were asking about integration as microservices. And at first, we thought that doesn't really make sense. Everything in our mind was oriented around the engine, but we took it back and we thought about it really hard and said, maybe we can implement something as microservices. Let's investigate that. So we did. And my point in mentioning this is that we made foundational changes to the way we've architected our solutions as results of customer suggestions and customer ideas. So don't be shy about mentioning these to us. Maybe we'll be able to do something with the suggestion and maybe we won't, but we love to hear them, and sometimes it makes a profound impact on what we're doing. Coming next, we'll probably build more of these microservices. We have a white paper on cloud strategy coming out. We're trying to figure out the most tactical ways to support these hybrid implementations. So we'll be working on that as well. And we also intend to enable cross-organizational connections more easily. CorePoint and Rhapsody are in something like 900 hospitals in the US. And it feels like that's an opportunity to collect those engines into a network and make it easy to share data across them with the appropriate consent in place. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at. Okay, so moving on to the third trend is FHIR adoption, and this one is super exciting for us. I want to start by talking about the different standards that are in use in healthcare, and I've outlined some of them on that timeline along with the year that they debuted. Some of these years may be off by a little bit. I got the dates by Googling, and I just took the first one that I found. So if some of these are off by a bit, I'm okay with being a little bit wrong because it's directionally correct. But what we predict with respect to FHIR is that even as FHIR debuts and starts to take off, it's not going to displace the existing standards. There's a lot of existing interfaces built on standards like HL7 version 2 and CCD and DICOM. There's no need to migrate them, right? They ain't broke, so don't fix it. Plus, just the volume of migrating them is too big of an effort to contemplate when it's already working just fine. Plus, these standards were built to solve a specific problem. And even though there's a new standard coming out relevant in terms of FHIR, that doesn't mean that the problems those old standards have solved has gone away. In other words, like take, for example, HL7 version 2. It has an event model built into the standard itself, which really nicely reflects the events that take place in the real world in a hospital. And trying to replicate that in another standard like CCD or FHIR isn't the easiest thing in the world. And since the event model in HL7 version 2 is so darn useful, we expect it to stay in place pretty much forever for that reason. So we've got all these standards on the timeline to think about. We've got all the standards in the bullet points below to think about, plus many more that, I mean, this is just the brainstorm that I had when I was trying to think of standards that our customers use on a day-to-day basis. If everyone did their own brainstorm, we could probably come up with 100 more. So there's tons of standards out there. There's no shortage of standards. And none of them is going away, right? We're keeping all of them for the foreseeable future. In fact, I don't know of, I can think of one standard that we've retired in healthcare IT. If you can think of any standards we retired in healthcare IT, put it in the chat, and we'll talk about that. But mostly standards get born and then they live forever. And so they're additive. And we're adding one more. We're adding another one with FHIR. So where is FHIR adoption? Well, if you mean where in its life cycle, that's answered by the Gartner hype curve on the right. I've taken a stab at mapping the Gartner phases to years and events on the FHIR timeline. So when we had draft standard for trial use version 1 in 2013, I feel like that was the technology trigger. So 2013, 2014 is when the curve started for FHIR. I feel like when FHIR was encoded in the meaningful use or promoting interoperability rules, that was sort of the peak of expectations. Everyone thought that now that EMR vendors are required to implement FHIR, that's going to make it take off. And what we saw was that didn't happen. The EHR vendors implemented FHIR. They checked the compliance box, but the ecosystem of vendors didn't spring up around it immediately. And that's taken some time, but I think we're finally getting to a place where where that's starting to be rectified. And most recently, we've had the ONC and CMS regulations around patient access and anti-information blocking. And I think that's really the thing that's going to kick FHIR into high gear. And so we'll start to reach the plateau of productivity in the near future here. If you're asking where is FHIR adoption geographically, the map on the left shows the heat map of adoption in the US. The darker colors are higher concentrations of adoption, and the lighter colors are lower concentrations. This data is starting to get pretty old. It's from 2019, but the ONC published this. Unfortunately, they haven't really kept it up to date. I suspect that by today, we see a lot more of the dark red on the map. And in the future, it's going to be even more so. So we also have this timeline of where FHIR is going. This is sort of my go-to graphic for when people ask about the compliance deadlines from ONC and CMS. As you can see, in the next couple of years, there's a lot of deadlines related to FHIR API. And so all the providers and all the payers will be required to implement FHIR APIs for patient access. And so we expect that to drive adoption. I think that going forward, we'll see more emphasis on Smart on FHIR. And the thing that's really interesting to me is CDS hooks. CDS is clinical decision support. And really what this does is it allows the EHR to expose certain points in the workflow that external applications can hook onto. And then it uses FHIR APIs to transfer data from the EHR to the third-party application. And these are the types of apps that are in Epic's App Orchard, or other EHR vendors have similar marketplaces to distribute these apps. But what it does is it lets third parties inject their data into the EHR workflow in a way that is approved by the EHR vendors. In other words, there's always been resistance of the EHR to allow anyone to modify their processes and workflows, and even the way their screens look, other than their customers. And the reason is because they want to make sure that the customers have a proper experience. They don't want to take a chance of a bad actor or an incompetent actor injecting bad workflow into the EHR. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's third-party vendors that are delivering good functionality, and there's hospitals and other customers that want to incorporate that functionality into their EHR. And so the compromise has been to establish these hooks in the EHR's workflow that give really specific targeted places to exchange defined types of information with third parties so that you can have that hybrid experience. And this is still very early, but as it takes off, I think it's going to help make that EHR experience quite a bit richer. And it'll go back to the earlier point we made about workflows happening outside of the EHR. Instead of being limited to the workflows that the EHR vendors provide, hospitals will be able to expand the functionality to include information from third parties. So that'll be a pretty cool development as that starts to take off. Okay, so what has Lineate done to progress FHIR as a trend? We had the session yesterday that covered a lot of this. We have some training options. First of all, we have the FHIR First Steps training, which is switching from an in-person experience to a computer-based experience, which will help us scale availability substantially. The second step in our FHIR training offerings is FHIR training from a third party called FHIRly. You may have heard of them. They're really well known in the FHIR universe. What we found was that we sort of had this gap in our curriculum that would follow on from the FHIR First Steps training, and we set about to develop a successor to FHIR First Steps. And what we found was that there's already good content out there. In fact, FHIRly is well known to produce the best content. And so instead of trying to reinvent that wheel, we decided to partner with FHIR and bring them into our curriculum. So if you want that second step of training, we can provide it via FHIR for you. And then the third step is FHIR Workshop that is run through our co-creation lab. And this is sort of an on-site or virtual on-site experience where our co-creation lab experts come into your environment and provide FHIR expertise, mostly oriented around our integration engines, to our customers in their exact setting to solve their exact problems. So it's a highly customized workshop around your exact use cases. So that's our training spectrum. We've also got some product offerings. We have standard support in the CorePoint and Rhapsody engines for FHIR and REST APIs in general. That's been there a long time. And we've also debuted the Rapid API Gateway, which you heard about yesterday. So that's sort of our product lineup around APIs, and that's what we've done to help boost the FHIR trend. And so I'm going to move on to our first poll question, and this is interactive, so you guys can all respond to this. What are you doing with FHIR? And the spectrum is from nothing at all the way to you have an enterprise API strategy. So please respond to that, and as we start to get answers and move on, we'll show you the results on the next slide. And while you're doing that, I'm going to take a minute to catch up on the chat and the questions. And I'll point out that for each of the trends that we talked about, each of those first three trends, there was something specific that Lineate did in response to that. And so you may be sitting there thinking, well, you've cherry-picked these trends to match what you guys were doing anyway. And that's not really true. It's actually the opposite. We chose what we were working on this year in response to the trends we saw going on in the industry. And so if there's a concordance between what we've worked on and what I'm saying the trends in health IT are, it's because we're focused on where the puck is going, and we're trying to skate to that place. And so a lot of the work we do is aligned with the trends that we see. So I'm just checking the questions in the Q&A. John asks, how are the microservices going to be priced transactionally? Yes, transactionally. So I think the way that it's priced is you prepay for a certain number of transactions, and then you can make that many calls during the time period. And it works out pretty cheaply. It's on the webpage that I had a screenshot of. I think if you use the full quota, it works out to about 1 cent per transaction. So it is priced transactionally, and it's a fairly low unit price. Can we get the names of the 2 books I mentioned? Yes, you can. I will put them in the chat, but just to repeat them, it's Preventable by Andy Slavitt and Uncontrolled Spread by Scott Gottlieb. And when we get toward the end of the session, I'll put the exact titles in the chat. We're still getting a few responses. It's starting to slow down. We have about 43% of people have voted. So last call for getting your poll submissions in, and then we'll move on to look at the results. Okay. Moving on. So here's the results of the poll. It looks like a little over half have no specific concrete API strategy. And then from there, it goes on to 10% pilot projects up through 15% of multiple projects, very few with an enterprise API strategy. So there you have it. Awesome. So let's move on to talk about what new trends can we add to our portfolio of trends. And there's no shortage of them. In fact, if we take a look at this slide, it shows the internal tool we use for tracking what's coming next. And there's obviously a lot of them on here. I think we track about 50 trends. And I only want to add one for this year. I don't want to add a large number to try and manage. We'll just add one this year. But the tool you're looking at is informally called our radar. Formally, it's called the Online Catalog of Emerging Lineate Opportunities and Threats. And whenever you hear a long name for something like that, you can tell that someone's trying to back into an acronym. So this tool is called Ocelot, and it has a cool icon. And it's a place where we can track the emerging trends as they come into view and start to impact us. And a funny story, I had not intended this to be the literal tool. When I was pitching the idea of tracking trends, I put together a PowerPoint deck to sort of outline what I was thinking. And I wanted to use the metaphor of, we need an early warning system for things that are happening. Our goal is to never be surprised by an opportunity or a threat. And so we want to track them as they emerge. And as part of that deck, I put in a slide with a radar that had, it looked kind of like this. It had targets with the names of trends that we were tracking. And it was intended as an example or an illustration only. And so when the real project came about, I said, it's not literally going to be a radar screen. We're just going to have a list that we track, the proximity and how much we know about each thing. And I got pushback because people really like the radar visualization. So I spent a couple of hours trying to figure out the arithmetic of mapping numbers 1 to 5 in terms of rating the score into the polar coordinates required to make Excel draw this radar graph. So it's a little bit fragile. You have to be careful about how you put stuff in, but it updates automatically when we make changes to the radar. So this one's a couple of weeks old by now, so some of these triangles will have moved around. But you can see we divided up into 4 quadrants. We have business drivers, healthcare policy drivers, technology drivers, and different segments that we think about. So an example of a segment is payers, right? I mean, that's quite near the center. Payers are increasingly interested in healthcare interoperability, and so we see that as a near-term opportunity. Some of the other things, we have a couple of them. You can see in the technology quadrant, we have microservices. We think that's a little bit further out. I mean, microservices are here already. I mean, technologically, they're a thing. But in terms of adoption within healthcare, we think they're a bit further out. And so when we did that pilot of the Lambda function in AWS, that was kind of one of the things we did in response to microservices being on the radar. We wanted to start to get some experience with them, and so we used that as a way to learn more about microservices. And so now we have a pretty good understanding of what they are, how we can build them, and how we can think about them in terms of interoperability. You can see also in the technology quadrant, Smart on FHIR is quite near the middle. And that means it's very, very imminent. So we think that that's going to start to make an impact on the industry quite soon. So we're tracking, like I said, dozens of these. And any one of these would be a suitable candidate for a 4th trend that we should track. But the one that we settled on for today's presentation is robotic process automation. And you can see from the shaded line that we're starting to see this take off right now, and we expect it to be prominent in the future. So I'll begin by asking, what is robotic process automation? And the answer, unfortunately, is that it has nothing to do with robots, literally, which actually is something I learned when we started tracking RPA. It's really about creating these automated scripts that are called bots that perform repetitive data retrieval and data entry tasks. If this sounds like what we used to call screen scraping, that's not completely off base, but it's definitely a step beyond that. So screen scraping used to be if you had a system that really couldn't interface, you could use the UI and copy the text off of the screen and turn that into structured data. And RPA can do that, but it can do a lot more too. It can also simulate user input so that it has the ability to bidirectionally interface with a UI instead of one direction. And it has a lot of sophisticated workflow options. And in some cases, it has AI built in so that it can make decisions about the data that it's seeing or the actions that it wants to take. And so RPA is really kind of an interesting technology, and it's good at exploiting or taking full advantage of existing software assets without modifying them or trying to do back-end integration. You know, normally we're used to systems that have an HL7 feed or some way of getting data in and out, but a lot of the systems that we're starting to integrate with in healthcare just don't have that capability, or if they do, it's too hard or too expensive to take on. And so going through the user interface is a good option. And for these reasons, RPA is well liked by both the financial team, the chief financial officer, as well as the CIO. I mean, it's providing a structured way to take advantage of software we've already paid for. So that makes it extremely appealing to a lot of stakeholders. And you know, one reason we see this as an emerging trend in healthcare is because it's already popular outside of healthcare. And healthcare often adopts technologies after they've been proven outside of healthcare because of security requirements, and just you know, healthcare is a reasonably conservative industry when it comes to adopting new technologies, and rightly so. I mean, we're managing the most valuable data in the world, and so we don't want to adopt every new technology on version 1, because oftentimes it's not until version 2 or 3 of a technology that that it's really hardened and ready for use in a critical situation like the ones that we face. But RPA has been around a long time outside of healthcare. If you start to read about RPA, you're going to see the term swivel chair every place. And it means that today a human enters data into one system and then swivels their chair and enters it into another system. And they probably have 2 workstations or 2 tabs open in their browser. They're doing duplicate entry, or they're reading data out of one system and typing it into another system. And that's the problem that RPA solves. And it's very similar to, you know, the back-end middleware integration that we're familiar with, but it goes through the front end of the existing software, which makes it a nice complement to existing integration solutions. You have the ability to tie together systems on the back end if they support an interface like that, and you have the ability to go in through the user interface if they don't provide any other alternative. And you have the ability, you know, if you have both the integration engine and the RPA engine, you have the ability to translate between the two. You can use the RPA engine to get data out of a system that doesn't have an interface, and then turn that into an HL7 message and send it to another system downstream. So the two technologies are very complementary, and it could open up some interesting use cases. And then, you know, the benefits, like we said on the previous slide, it's a way to leverage existing investments. It gives you reuse of your existing tools, processes, software assets, and it takes care of a lot of the foundational requirements and allows your users to focus on their specific projects rather than data entry, which is time-consuming and error-prone. We do have a partner in this space. We'll talk about partners a little bit later, but our partner for RPA is called RPA Health. They're based in the UK, and I think they put out a press release yesterday about our partnership. So that's fairly hot off the presses. Okay, and so next poll question is, what are you guys doing with robotic process automation? If you're doing anything, we'd love to hear from you about what your use cases are and what your experience has been. It will inform our presentation for next year when we update the trends again. And if you're not using it, we'd love to hear why not, or if you're thinking about it, or what you think about that. So I'll take another opportunity to catch up on the questions in the chat while people respond to the poll. And next we will move on to the real substance of what we were here to talk about, because that whole prelude was really about updating our prior position on where those trends were. Okay, we still have some responses coming in, so I'll give it just another minute or two. Wow, they're still coming in fast, so I'm going to pause just another minute. Okay, let's move on and see the results. Interesting. So for 70%, this is the first they've heard of it. So that means that our estimate was correct, that the trend is just starting to take off. Interesting that 14% of customers already are doing projects in this space. We will keep you updated. Like I said, next year we'll have an update on the trends, but in the meantime, we'll stay in communication and let you know what we're seeing with respect to RPA. Okay, so moving on. The name of this session is Interoperability Evolved, and it took me all the way until slide 31 to actually start talking about it. So, way to bury the lead. And what I want to start with is this diagram, which we had in last year's presentation, so you might remember it. It's the way that we think about interoperability. What we found is that when we say interoperability, whoever we're talking to has a different definition based on where they're coming from, which is only natural. And so to clarify the different types of interoperability, we built this diagram. And we've been using it for a long time, and it's hardly had any changes. There's just one change that I'll talk about. But basically, there's 3 layers of interoperability. I'll start in the middle with organizational interoperability. This is connecting systems within a single organization. And most of our customers fall into this category. When they say interoperability, they mean implementing an integration solution to connect their internal systems, their EMR and their billing system and their lab system and so forth. This is the type of interoperability that's characterized by HL7 transactions, and it's been around a long time. It's sort of where we specialize. Also, within an organization, there are devices. There's medical devices at the patient's bedside that are connected to the same integration engine. There's consumer devices that are outside of the organization that are also connected to, in some cases, the organization's data feeds. The only change we've made in years is in the device layer. We used to render medical devices and consumer devices as separate boxes, but what we found is that medical devices are starting to creep into patients' homes, and consumer devices, like obviously the Apple Watch has great heart monitoring capabilities. The consumer devices are starting to get so good that they're beginning to look like medical devices. And so the lines are blurring there. And so we've started to render that devices box as a continuum rather than as separate boxes. At the top, we have cross-organizational interoperability. And this is any time that an organization needs to talk to some other organization. So it's like the HIE use case, or when one hospital needs to transfer records to another, or provider-to-payer interactions. That's the type of cross-organizational interop that we're talking about. And the reason it's a separate box is because there's different data governance concerns when you're sending data outside an organization. There's also different standards at play. This is commonly where we see CCD documents being exchanged with IHE transactions rather than HL7 transactions. Although, when you think about like ADT notifications, that can also be a cross-organizational communication that is based on an HL7 transaction. So cross-organizational is where we see a lot of activity happening today. And then over on the right, we have patient or member or consumer interoperability, whatever you want to call it. And we've always had that out there because we know that there are parties out there talking about interoperability as if it means transferring data to the person that the data is about. And that's really gotten supercharged in the last year as the CMS and ONC rules start to take effect. And the patient, member, consumer will want to get data from devices, from hospitals, and from HIEs or other cross-organizational places. So this is the way we always used to think about interoperability. It's a very technical, operational definition. And one way that we've evolved our thinking is to introduce a different diagram. We've debuted this diagram this year, and it starts to talk about the continuum of care from patient care, which is what might happen in a hospital or a long-term care facility, through community care, social care, and preventive care. We see this as not distinct activities, which has been the case in the past, but really as a continuum, and there needs to be handoffs. And then around the edges, you can see the different types of data that contribute to the success of this continuum. And although the different types of data around the edges are mapped onto specific parts of the continuum, that's not really indicative that they only apply to that part. It's really just saying that these types of data contribute to the overall continuum. So we do call out financial data in there. I see a question in the Q&A about payers and financial transactions. For sure, payers are cross-organizational interoperability, and financial data is right here. The idea of this graph, this graphic compared to the previous one, is a less technical, less operational view, and more of a, how is the data used? How are the transactions used? And what benefits are they providing to the world? So it gives us a more user-centric or patient-centric way of, human-centric way of thinking about interoperability. So instead of thinking about, is the data going from one organization to another, we're thinking about, is the data used for prevention or for community care? Is it going to an immunization registry? Is it going to health and wellness data? Which way is it going, and who's it helping? So this doesn't necessarily obsolete the previous diagram, but it's a good complement to it because it gives us a way to focus on why are we doing this interoperability instead of how are we doing this interoperability. And that shift in mindset is important to us because it's really why we're here at the end of the day, is to make a healthier planet and not just to think about the bits and bytes, although we do have to do that in order to achieve our goal. Interestingly, this infinity symbol has a name, a fancy name. It's called a lemniscate, and that's a mathematical term that comes from the Latin word that means to decorate with ribbons. And I don't know why. Maybe because this bow shape looks like a bow that you might tie in a ribbon on top of a present. So interoperability is our present to healthcare. I guess that's the way to think about it. But yeah, if you find yourself embroiled in a vocabulary contest, you can use the word lemniscate to probably get some points. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about our partner ecosystem, because one of the ways that we can help enable those types of transactions on the lemniscate is through our partners. We do what we do, and we know that we do it really well, but we don't do everything involved in interoperability. Where we leave off, there's other vendors that pick up. And so we want to establish relationships with those other vendors so that we can present a full, coherent interoperability picture to our customers. We want to pre-establish those relationships, and substantially we want to pre-establish connections to those vendors so that we have a coherent, easy way to bring them into conversations. And the connections that we build are different in every case. It depends on the type of counterparty, the type of vendor that we're talking about. But for most of the technology vendors, we're building connectors to our existing engines of CorePoint and Rhapsody into those other vendors' systems. The most recent one we built, it's almost ready to be released, is for clinical architecture, which is a terminology services vendor. And what we do is we figure out the use cases of, basically we ask the question, why would you want to incorporate clinical architecture's functionality into an interface in CorePoint or in Rhapsody? And we think through those workflows, and we build configurations to adapt to those workflows. We build a configuration, and we deliver it with a little web page that has a lot of functionality in it that helps you manage those configurations, and deliver that as a package that you can use to accelerate your connections if you happen to be using that vendor. And we've got several of these already. And the thing that I think is really nice is that we don't deliver this as a product feature because there's too much volatility, right? Every time that our software changes or the other vendor's software changes, we may need to make updates to that configuration. And based on our release schedule, it doesn't make sense to try and keep track of all those things. Plus which, we don't know what versions our customers necessarily have of our software or the other party's software. And so the way we deliver this functionality is actually as a professional services engagement. So we take the configurations that we've pre-built, and we spend just a few hours as a professional services engagement installing them in your engine and then doing a handover to your team, so that it makes it clear like exactly how to use the configuration and how to modify it if necessary. And from that point on, it evolves on your schedule, not on ours. So it takes the volatility concern out of our hands and makes it an interface maintenance issue, which is the same as what you're already managing. So it's kind of a clean way to deliver the configuration without having to enter into a new software agreement. It's a professional services agreement that's usually pretty easy to implement, and it makes it a nice clean package. So if you're using any of these vendors and are interested in a connector to them, please contact us. If you're using other vendors that you think would be good for us to build a connector to, send those through as well. We're trying to establish as many as we can, and we've got a pipeline of them, and next year's slide will have even more boxes, I'm sure. Okay, and then as we start to wrap up, I can revisit this slide from last year's presentation. What we have indicated here is our adaptive or our learning interoperability ecosystem loop. And it starts on the left. I've called it practice and results, but what this means is whenever we do something, if we implement a product feature, or especially if we do an engagement or a project for a customer, there's really two results. So that's the practice, is implementing a product feature or doing a project. That's the practice. And the practice has two outputs. One is the actual result of that project. So if we're building an interface for a customer, one of the outputs of that project is that exact interface. But the other output that we get is a little bit less tangible. It's the experience of having done it. And as we start to get more experience with doing these types of projects, we can start to imagine improvements to our process and to our technology and to our features. And so that's that path. We do a project, we get the experience, and we drive improvements into the system. The other place that improvements can come from is from basic research. We can learn new stuff, like we did with the AWS Lambda services. We can do a project to specifically around research. Research can come from anywhere. And we can also use that to drive improvements. And the output of those improvements goes back to the beginning of the diagram and reflects an updated practice. And so by executing the cycle over and over, we can get better and better. And in the past, we've focused on sort of that top path from practice to experience to improvements. Going forward, we're focusing more on the research part of it. And this isn't a change or a shift. This is an addition to what we're already doing. What we found is that good ideas can come from anywhere, but it's easy to have an idea and hard to turn it into a product improvement or a process improvement. And so that's the problem that we want to tackle going forward, is how do we go from an idea to an idea definition to an experiment to an actual deliverable improvement. And that process is being taken care of by our co-creation lab. They've already been working with customers and on other projects in that vein. And so we've added to their scope of responsibility the idea of formally moving things through this research pipeline. So anything that we think of that we'll want to put through that research pipeline will be managed by the co-creation lab. and in a structured way with a structured process will be used to drive improvements into our products and our practices and our overall operations. And so I think in next year's update, you'll see a lot more information about that. You'll see some of the things that have come through that innovation process through the co-creation lab and start to see how they can impact the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So wrapping up, there's a lot of changes happening in our business, which I think that an advantage of having a user group every year is that that's a decent chunk of time between the last user group and the current one for us to do quite a lot of stuff. Like in the past year since the last user group, we introduced Envoy, we introduced Rapid. We've made all sorts of changes that you've been hearing about all week. And so, there's a lot of great stuff going on. And so the types of changes we're going to attack going forward are really two in nature. The first is to do better things. We're going to improve our existing products. We're going to add new products, new offerings, new services, new practices. And we're also going to do things better. We're going to optimize our business processes and our technical processes and everything we do to optimize what we're doing, with the goal of building a better ecosystem that we can all succeed in going forward together. So a major theme of last year's talk was about the ecosystem, and hopefully I haven't been as explicit about it in this year's talk, but hopefully you see the ecosystem threads that tie everything together. Because we want to continue to evolve interoperability as our way of enabling a healthier world. It's right there in our vision statement, and it's really what we're talking about. So things will be changing in the future. We will bring out new products. We'll bring out improvements, but some things will stay the same forever. We're always going to stay in healthcare interoperability, and we're always going to do things that are aligned with our values, which they're a big deal internally. I don't know how much we've said about them externally, but we organized our whole company around these 4 values of putting others first, be curious, be purpose-driven, and staying optimistic. We hire and fire and promote and organize our entire company based on these values. So it's not a plaque that we put on the wall and walk past in the hallway. This is something that we work on all the time. So those are the things you can count on to stay consistent no matter what else changes. So with that, I'd like to conclude it. If there's any final questions or comments, you can put them in the chat or the QA. But what I'd like to do is wrap up with one last poll, just to see which of Lineate's 4 values resonate with you the most. And we'll leave this one open for a bit so that everyone can have their input. And in the meantime, I'll look back through the chat and the questions to see if there's anything I can address while that's going on. Okay, it looks like the chat is pretty quiet. And I'm not seeing a lot of questions. So that's good. It means we hopefully addressed everything. I will put the titles of those books in the chat right now. Okay, so those are the 2 titles. Those aren't really formatted that great, but hopefully you can read them. And with that, we'll sign off. So thanks for attending today. The next session is coming up, but in order to show you that slide, I would need to close the poll. But I can tell you that it's the next session is about managing integration and growth in the cloud with our friends from University of Louisville. So that's coming up next. And I'll leave the poll open for just another minute. But other than that, thank you for attending today's session.